Couple of things to notice about our proof. First of all, our one premise is just a universal generalization. Chances are we will have to use UI eventually, but notice that at least as a direct step to our conclusion, it's not all that helpful. We need our quantifiers embedded, if you will, within the conditional, and there's not going to really be a way to, if you will, break off the FA by itself and then generalize over it or something. You know, there's not a legal way to do it, so I'm not sure what the temptation might be. But the fact that our premise doesn't really lead anywhere indicates that we are going to be using subproofs here. The other big indication that a subproof is going to be our ideal strategy is because our conclusion is indeed a conditional, and so our thought should be to CP. Now CP says assume the antecedent as your assumption for conditional proof and then try to derive the consequent. So that means we are going to assume that everything is an F, and what we're going to want to try to derive is that everything is a G. There are also some other things that you want to notice. First of all, like we said before, you are probably going to be using UI somewhere, and because what we want to derive at the end of our subproof is also a universal generalization, chances are we're going to be using UG somewhere along the way too. And remember, whenever you have or are likely to use UI and UG together, then your instantial letter when you use UI should be a variable. Right, making sure that you UI with a variable means that later on your UG step will be permitted. And then lastly, although I don't know if this is something to notice or just the way that the proof proceeds, but the argument says, look, all F's are G's, and then the conclusion says, well, if everything is an F, then everything is a G. If everything is an F and all F's are G's, then it follows with modus ponens that everything will be a G too. But of course we don't actually have a conditional in line 1, and so we can't use modus ponens yet. But of course what we do have are universal generalizations. We've known that we're going to want to use UI. We'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll double check our modus ponens pattern again, and we'll find that we can use it, of course. Now, so in terms of how this proof proceeds, this is of course a subproof. We know that we're going to want to use UI, and we know that we're going to want to use it with a variable. So for example, UI on line 1, we'll use an instantial variable instead of an instantial constant, and this is in preparation for using UG later on. We still don't have the ingredients for modus ponens. We're awfully close, but line 2 is that everything's an F, and line 3, the antecedent, is just X of F. So we need to use UI again with the same instantial variable as we used in line 3. And then now, finally, we do have the ingredients for modus ponens. That's on 3 and 4. And we're not done yet. Everything is a G is, of course, what we actually want at the end of our subproof. We prepared for using UG on line 5 by using a variable when we used UI. And so the restriction on UG that says that we can only use UG on a variable, we're okay there. Now there's a new restriction that does not actually apply here, but it's worth checking out. There's a new restriction on CP and subproofs that says that the variable that we generalize over can't occur as a free variable in the first line of the subproof. And in line 2, which is the first line of our subproofs, there are no free variables at all, and so we're okay on that restriction as well. We want to derive that everything was a G because it was our desired consequent, and so now we're ready and able to actually close our CP proof. We write down the first line of the subproof, and then a horseshoe, and then the last line of the subproof. Now, there's one more thing that might be worth pointing out here, although it is old news. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to point out that's old news, but still worth drawing your attention to just as a reminder. Notice that our premise used the x variable and that our conclusion used the y variable. Our assumption for CP correctly matched the y in the antecedent of the conclusion. Our last line correctly matches the y in the consequent of the conclusion. And of course, our final line is an exact match for the conclusion with those y variables. Now, it is true that, well, the variables really are just placeholders. There's no difference whatsoever between, say, this sentence and this sentence in terms of what they mean. They both say all F's are G's, but you do want to make sure that when you are constructing a proof or an argument that the symbols match up exactly. And so that's why we use Y's here in lines 2 and 6 and 7, is just to make sure that we actually match up with our conclusion.